NASA just committed $30 billion and 79 launches to building a permanent base on the moon. They announced habitat modules, nuclear reactors, rovers, and landing pads. They set a deadline. They named a program director. For the first time in half a century, a crewed lunar base is not a concept study or a PowerPoint slide. It is a funded plan with named contractors and hardware already in development. And that is exactly what makes this terrifying. Because the closer you look at what staying on the moon actually requires, day after day, night after freezing night, the more clearly you see the gap between reaching another world and surviving on it. The moon is not far away. It is close enough to tempt us, and harsh enough to punish us for trying to stay. If you want more deep science that goes beyond headlines, hit like and subscribe. We cover the stories that actually matter, the ones most channels will not touch. Now, are you comfortable? Let's begin. On March 24th, 2026, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman stood in front of a packed room at NASA headquarters and said something no administrator had said in 50 years and actually meant. NASA is going to build a base on the moon. Not study one, not plan for one, build one, with money, rockets, contractors, and deadlines. He called the event Ignition. Everything NASA has said about a moon base for the last 2 decades has been a slow, endlessly deferred promise. This time, the promise came with a price tag, $30 billion over 11 years, and a hardware list so specific it left no room for the ambiguity that lets space programs quietly fade into budget reports. The plan is built in 3 phases. Phase 1 runs through 2028. During that window, NASA aims to achieve what it calls reliable, high-rate access to the lunar surface. That means commercial landers delivering equipment, rovers surveying terrain, drones scouting potential base sites, and ultimately the first crewed lunar landing under the Artemis program since Apollo. Phase 2 extends from 2029 through 2032. During this stage, astronauts would begin arriving at the lunar South Pole every 6 months. Habitat modules would be delivered and connected. Power systems would be installed. The base would begin to take shape as a functional outpost rather than a temporary camp. Phase 3 carries the vision through 2036 and beyond. A nuclear reactor would be deployed to provide continuous electricity. The outpost would transition from intermittently crewed to permanently occupied. Astronauts would live and work on the moon, not for days, but for months at a time. The numbers behind that plan are staggering. 79 launches, 73 landers, 10 lunar terrain vehicles, 12 hopper drones, 4 habitat modules, a 20-kilowatt nuclear fission reactor, landing pads constructed from compressed lunar soil, berms of piled regolith, to shield habitats from rocket exhaust and flying debris during arrivals and departures. Communications relays, power distribution systems, pressurized rovers capable of carrying astronauts across the surface for days without returning to base. Carlos Garcia Gallan, the official NASA appointee to oversee the moon base effort, was blunt about the ambition. He told reporters that the plan is deliberately aggressive, that NASA wants to discover what actually prevents a moon base from being built, rather than spend another decade theorizing about it. Every asset, every kilogram, every dollar of lunar exploration resources would now be focused on one objective: build the base. The Lunar Gateway, a small space station that had been under development for years to orbit the moon and serve as a waypoint for surface missions, was effectively set aside. Components already built for Gateway would be redirected to support the surface base instead. The message was clear. NASA is done with halfway measures. It is done with orbital holding patterns. The destination is the surface, and the goal is to stay there. Now here is why this moment feels different from every moon base announcement that came before it. This is not the first time NASA has said it wants to build a base on the moon. In 2006, under the Constellation program, the agency laid out plans for a lunar outpost with habitats and pressurized rovers and a target date of 2024. That program was cancelled. In 2019, under the original Artemis framework, NASA proposed something called Artemis Base Camp, a conceptual surface presence at the South Pole with a habitable rover and a surface habitat. That concept never received dedicated funding and remained a set of aspirational diagrams on a website. Before that, there were proposals under the Space Exploration Initiative in 1989. Before that, early post-Apollo studies in the 1970s imagined permanent settlements. None of them survived contact with political cycles, budget battles, and the slow erosion of institutional will. What makes the 2026 announcement structurally different is that it arrives at a moment when three things are true simultaneously for the first time. The first is that the launch infrastructure is closer to ready than it has ever been. SpaceX is flight testing Starship, the largest launch vehicle ever built, designed to serve as a crewed lunar lander. Blue Origin is preparing its own lander and has a contract to deliver NASA's Viper rover to the South Pole. The commercial launch industry now operates at a tempo and cost structure that makes high-volume lunar delivery physically plausible in a way it never was before. The second is political momentum. A December 2025 executive order directed NASA to prioritize the moon, mandating a crewed landing by 2028 and a permanent outpost by 2030. That order shapes budget requests and directs procurement. It is an instruction from the executive branch, and the agency is responding with the most detailed surface architecture plan it has ever published. The third is that Artemis II, the first crewed lunar mission since Apollo 17 in 1972, has successfully flown. As of early 2026, 4 astronauts have looped around the moon and returned safely. The spacecraft performed. Life support systems were tested. The trajectory worked. The emotional and institutional barrier of sending humans back to lunar distance has been broken. The next step, landing, is no longer a hypothetical leap. It is the next item on a flight manifest. When you stack those 3 conditions together, the current moon base plan occupies a position that none of its predecessors ever did. It has rockets, it has political backing, and it has the psychological momentum of a successful crewed mission proving that the hardware works. For the first time in the modern era, the idea of a permanent human outpost on the moon is not aspirational language in a planning document. It is an engineering program with purchase orders, and that is precisely what makes this moment so important to examine carefully. Because as long as a moon base was a concept, a dream, a diagram on a slide, its challenges could be hand-waved away. They were future problems. Problems for the engineers who would someday have to deal with them. Problems that would be solved when we got there. Now we are getting there. And the problems are no longer theoretical. They are operational. They have dimensions and timelines and failure modes that will kill people if they are not solved before the first crew arrives for a long stay. To understand why the jump from landing on the moon to living on it is so much larger than it appears, you first have to understand what the Apollo missions actually proved and what they did not. Between 1969 and 1972, 12 human beings walked on the surface of the moon. They are still the only humans who have ever set foot on another world. Their missions were extraordinary, among the greatest achievements in the history of the species. They also lasted at most 3 days on the surface. Apollo 17, the longest surface stay, kept 2 astronauts on the moon for approximately 75 hours. That is a little over 3 Earth days. During that time, the astronauts operated from a lander that served as both their shelter and their ride home. They carried their own oxygen. They ate pre-packaged food. They had no running water, no waste recycling, no shielding beyond the walls of the lunar module. They wore spacesuits that were designed to survive a few hours of surface activity and were showing serious wear by the end of each mission. The dust alone was a crisis. It clung to everything, invaded every seal, scratched every visor, and filled the cabin with a sharp, acrid smell that the astronauts compared to gunpowder. Apollo proved that humans could reach the moon, walk on it, collect samples, plant instruments, and return alive. What Apollo did not prove, and never attempted to prove, is that humans could stay. The distinction is not semantic. It is the difference between a camping trip and building a house. A camping trip requires you to carry what you need and leave before conditions overwhelm your supplies. Building a house requires you to solve every problem the environment throws at you, not once, but permanently. Water, air, temperature, waste, structural integrity, maintenance, resupply, every single day, with no option to pack up and drive home if something breaks. That is the gulf that separates the Artemis landing missions from the moon base that NASA is now proposing, and it is a gulf that most public discussion of the moon base quietly steps over as if it were a crack in the sidewalk rather than a canyon. Consider what a single crew rotation at a lunar base would actually require. The base is located at the lunar south pole, chosen because certain ridges there receive near continuous sunlight for solar power, and nearby permanently shadowed craters are believed to contain water ice deposited by ancient comet impacts. That water, if it exists in usable quantities, could theoretically be extracted, purified, and split into hydrogen and oxygen, providing both drinking water and rocket propellant. Those are real advantages. They are also, at this point, assumptions layered on top of orbital data and theoretical models. No human has ever visited the lunar South Pole. No instrument has ever directly confirmed the quantity, accessibility, or chemical purity of the ice deposits. NASA is building a base at the South Pole based in part on the expectation that a critical resource is waiting there in usable form. If the ice turns out to be too dispersed, too contaminated with regolith, or too deeply embedded in permanently shadowed terrain to extract economically, one of the foundational justifications for the base location becomes significantly weaker. But set that uncertainty aside for a moment and assume the ice is there. Assume the base is built. Assume the habitats are pressurized, the power systems are running, and a crew of 4 astronauts has arrived for a 6-month stay. From the moment they step off the lander, those 4 people are living inside a closed system that must provide every single thing their bodies need to survive. Oxygen must be generated or recycled continuously. Carbon dioxide must be scrubbed from the air. Water must be recycled from humidity, sweat, urine, and every other source available. Because every drop that is not recycled is a drop that must be launched from Earth at a cost of tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram. Food must be stored, prepared, and rationed across the entire stay, because there is no resupply mission arriving next week. There is no grocery store, there is no backup. If the food runs low, the crew waits or they leave. If they cannot leave, they starve. Waste management is not a convenience. It is a survival system. Human metabolism produces carbon dioxide, moisture, heat, urine, and fecal matter continuously. In a sealed habitat on the moon, every one of those outputs must be processed, stored, or recycled. A failure in waste processing does not mean discomfort. It means toxic gas accumulation, bacterial contamination, and cascading system failures in an environment where opening a window is not an option. Medical care is another dimension that most discussions gloss over. On the station, a crew member suffering a serious emergency can be returned to Earth within hours. On the moon, the return trip takes approximately 3 days under ideal conditions, assuming a return vehicle is fueled, positioned, and ready. If it is not, the delay stretches longer. A heart attack, a compound fracture, a burst appendix, an allergic reaction to dust exposure, any of these becomes a potential death sentence if the crew lacks the medical equipment and expertise to handle it on site. NASA is aware of all of this. The engineers designing the ignition architecture have spent careers thinking about closed-loop life support, redundant systems, and failure mode analysis. The point is not that NASA is unaware of the challenges. The point is that the public narrative around the moon base, the excitement, the headlines, the artist renderings of astronauts strolling across a sunlit lunar plain consistently underrepresents the sheer operational weight of what permanence on the moon demands. There is a phrase that engineers use when discussing the difference between a sortie mission and a sustained presence. They call it the logistics tail. A sortie mission, like an Apollo landing or an early Artemis surface stay, is self-contained. The crew brings everything they need and leaves before they run out. The logistics tail is short. It begins and ends with a single launch. A sustained presence is the opposite. The logistics tail stretches backward from the moon to the Earth, and it never stops. Every month the base operates, it consumes food, water, spare parts, medical supplies, replacement filters, new seals, lubricants, batteries, tools, and 1,000 other items that cannot be manufactured on the moon. Every one of those items must be launched from the surface of the Earth, carried across 384,000 kilometers of vacuum, and landed intact on the lunar surface. The cost per kilogram of delivering payload to the moon varies by vehicle and mission architecture, but even the most optimistic projections place it in the range of tens of thousands of dollars per kilogram. A single kilogram of water, a quantity that a human body requires roughly 2 to 3 liters of per day, costs more to deliver to the moon than most people earn in a month. That cost is not a one-time investment. It recurs. It recurs every crew rotation, every resupply flight, every equipment replacement cycle, for as long as the base exists. A base that operates for 10 years does not cost 10 times the price of building it. It costs 10 times the price of building it, plus the entire cumulative cost of keeping it alive for a decade. And that running cost is not optional. It is not a budget line that can be trimmed in a lean year. If the resupply mission does not arrive, the base begins to die. This is the operational reality that separates the bold announcement from the daily grind of actually running a lunar outpost. And it is the reality that transforms the moon from a destination into a demand. A demand on budgets, on launch cadence, on manufacturing pipelines, on political will sustained across multiple administrations and multiple congresses, year after year, with no interruption, because the people living on the moon cannot wait for a continuing resolution. There is a reason that the International Space Station, humanity's most ambitious permanent outpost in space, has required continuous international cooperation, hundreds of billions of dollars in cumulative spending, and an unbroken chain of resupply missions since its first module was launched in 1998. And the station orbits just 400 kilometers above the Earth, close enough to reach in 6 hours, close enough to evacuate in an emergency, close enough to receive cargo from multiple nations using multiple vehicles on a schedule measured in weeks rather than months. The moon is 1,000 times farther away. The transit time is 1,000 times longer. The landing is 1,000 times harder. The environment is 1,000 times less forgiving. And the consequence of a supply chain interruption is not inconvenience. It is death. NASA knows this. The ignition plan accounts for it, at least on paper. The phased approach, building capability gradually, learning from each mission, is designed precisely to confront these realities in sequence, rather than all at once. Garcia Galen has said publicly that the entire point of being deliberately aggressive with the timeline is to discover what the true barriers are before committing to permanence. That is a smart approach. It is the right approach. And it is also an admission that the barriers are not yet fully known. That the agency is building toward a goal whose difficulty has not been completely measured. That the plan is, in a very real sense, a test to find out how hard the moon actually is before deciding whether to stay. Here is what that admission means for the rest of this story. Everything NASA has announced, the habitats, the reactors, the rovers, the landing pads, the berms, the communications relays, all of it must function on a world that has been trying to destroy every piece of equipment humans have ever placed on it. The instruments Apollo left behind began failing far sooner than expected. Equipment designed for years of operation deteriorated within months. Sensors malfunctioned. Optical surfaces clouded. Thermal properties shifted as the lunar environment acted on materials in ways that ground testing had not fully predicted. And those were passive devices with no moving parts, no seals, no pressurized chambers, no life support loops. A habitat module is not a passive device. It is a pressurized vessel containing atmosphere, water, electronics, food stores, medical equipment, communication systems, thermal control hardware, and human beings. Every one of those components must function continuously in an environment defined by vacuum, radiation, abrasive dust, temperature extremes, and micrometeorite bombardment. Not for a 3-day visit, for months, for years, for as long as anyone calls it a base. The moon does not care about deadlines. It does not care about executive orders or budget allocations or political momentum. It is 239,000 miles of dead rock with no air, no water on the surface, no magnetic field, no protection from the radiation that streams in from every direction at every hour of every day. It has been that way for 4.5 billion years, and it will be that way long after every piece of hardware we send there has been ground to dust by the same forces that ground its own mountains into powder. What follows is the story of what those forces actually are, how they interact, and why they make the idea of a permanent human presence on the moon not impossible, but extraordinarily, relentlessly, punishingly difficult in ways that the boldest announcement in the world cannot wave away. The rockets are real, the funding is real, the ambition is genuine, and the moon is waiting, exactly as it has always been, offering nothing and forgiving nothing, daring us to stay. The moon looks clean. From Earth, it glows white and grey, smooth in places, cratered in others, but everywhere it looks like stone. Solid, stable, inert. That appearance is a lie. The lunar surface is covered in a layer of material so fine, so aggressive, and so fundamentally hostile to human technology that Apollo astronauts, who spent a combined total of less than 13 days on the moon across all 6 landing missions, identified it as one of the single greatest threats to everything they brought with them. Not the vacuum, not the radiation, not the temperature, the dirt. Lunar regolith is not soil. Soil is a biological product. It is rock that has been weathered by water, wind, and life over millions of years. Ground smooth, mixed with organic material, softened by chemistry. The material covering the moon has never been touched by water. It has never been shaped by wind. No biological process has ever acted on it. What covers the moon is the product of 4.5 billion years of mechanical destruction by a single relentless process: impact. Every hour of every day for longer than Earth has existed, the lunar surface has been bombarded by micrometeoroids. Tiny fragments of rock and metal traveling at speeds exceeding 96,000 kilometers per hour slam into the surface, shatter whatever they hit, and generate enough heat to partially melt or vaporize the surrounding material. The result is a layer of fragments that have been broken, rebroken, melted, fused, and shattered again across geological timescales that dwarf the entire history of life on Earth. The grains are not rounded like sand on a beach. They are angular, jagged, covered in sharp edges, and microscopic barbs that hook into surfaces on contact. Under an electron microscope, a grain of lunar dust looks less like a pebble and more like a piece of broken glass, wrapped in tiny fishhooks. That shape matters enormously. On Earth, dust is an annoyance. You wipe it off, you wash it away, you blow it out of machinery with compressed air. Lunar dust does not wipe off. The jagged barbs physically interlock with fabrics, seal surfaces, optical coatings, and skin. Worse, the dust is electrostatically charged. Without an atmosphere, without moisture, without the chemical processes that neutralize static charge on Earth, lunar dust picks up charge from solar, ultraviolet radiation, and the solar wind. The particles cling to every surface they contact with a tenacity that has no equivalent in terrestrial experience. They are attracted to metal, glass, fabric, rubber, and plastic with a force that makes simple cleaning nearly impossible. The Apollo astronauts discovered this within hours of their first surface excursions. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who walked on the moon during Apollo 17, described the dust invading everything. It coated visors, reducing visibility. It clogged mechanisms on sample containers. It worked its way into the wrist rings and neck rings of spacesuits, grinding against the seals that maintained pressurization. When the astronauts returned to the lunar module and removed their helmets, the cabin was filled with dust they had carried in on their suits. The smell was immediate, sharp, metallic, like spent gunpowder. Schmidt reported nasal congestion and irritation that he attributed directly to inhaling the fine particulate. The comparison to gunpowder is not poetic. Lunar dust contains nanophase iron, tiny particles of metallic iron embedded in the glass matrix of each grain, produced by the same micrometeoroid impacts that create the dust in the first place. When those grains contact moist tissue, the iron reacts. In laboratory studies, simulated lunar dust has been shown to generate reactive oxygen species on contact with human cell cultures. These are the same chemically aggressive molecules associated with asbestos exposure. They damage cell membranes. They attack DNA. They trigger inflammatory responses that, over repeated or prolonged exposure, can lead to fibrosis, chronic lung disease, and potentially cancer. Apollo astronauts were exposed for hours. A moon-based crew would be exposed for months. Every surface excursion, every airlock cycle, every suit removal would introduce fresh dust into the habitat. No matter how rigorous the cleaning protocol, some fraction would remain. It would accumulate on air filters. It would settle on food preparation surfaces. It would embed itself in the fabric of clothing and bedding. It would circulate through ventilation systems. Over weeks and months, the interior of a lunar habitat would become a low-level contamination zone, and the contaminant would be a substance that has never been tested for long-duration human exposure, because no human has ever been exposed to it for more than 75 hours. The damage to human bodies is only one dimension of the problem. The damage to equipment may be worse, not because equipment is more important than people, but because equipment failure on the moon translates directly into threats to human survival. Lunar dust is extraordinarily abrasive. It scratches optical surfaces, including camera lenses, sensor windows, solar panel glass, and helmet visors. During Apollo, visors became noticeably degraded after just a few hours of surface activity. The astronauts learned to avoid wiping their visors because dragging the dust across the surface gouged deeper scratches than leaving it in place. Solar panels, which convert sunlight into electricity, lose efficiency as dust accumulates on their surfaces. On Mars, dust accumulation on solar panels has been a emission-limiting factor for multiple rovers. On the Moon, where the dust is sharper and more adhesive than Martian dust, the problem would be compounded. Mechanical seals are another critical vulnerability. Every pressurized habitat, every airlock, every suit connection, every valve in a life support system depends on seals that maintain airtight closure under pressure differential. Lunar dust particles, with their jagged geometry, are precision tools for destroying seals. They embed in elastomer surfaces. They score metal mating surfaces. They wedge into gaps too small to see with the naked eye. Over repeated cycles of opening and closing, of pressurizing and depressurizing, of suits going out and coming back in, the seals degrade. Each cycle adds damage. Each excursion introduces fresh abrasive. The cumulative effect over months of operation is seal failure, and seal failure in a pressurized habitat is not a maintenance issue. It is an emergency. NASA is working on mitigation strategies. Suit port designs, where astronauts climb into suits mounted on the exterior of the habitat and never bring the contaminated suit inside, are one approach. Electrostatic dust removal systems that use electric fields to repel charged particles from surfaces are another. Specialized coatings that reduce dust adhesion are under development. Each of these is a partial solution. None of them eliminates the problem. They reduce the rate of contamination. They slow the degradation. But on a timeline of months or years, with thousands of airlock cycles and hundreds of surface excursions, Even a reduced rate of dust intrusion accumulates into a serious systemic burden. And dust is only the first of the 3 threats that define the lunar surface environment. The second is invisible, constant, and coming from every direction at once. Earth is shielded. Most people know the atmosphere blocks harmful radiation, and the ozone layer stops ultraviolet light. What most people do not appreciate is how many layers of protection exist between a human body on Earth's surface and the full radiation environment of open space. The first layer is the magnetosphere. Earth's liquid iron core generates a magnetic field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space, forming an invisible bubble that deflects the charged particles streaming outward from the star at the center of our solar system. Without that magnetic field, the solar wind would strip away the upper atmosphere over geological time, exactly as it did to Mars after Mars lost its own magnetic field billions of years ago. The second layer is the atmosphere itself. Roughly 100 kilometers of gas above the surface absorb and scatter incoming radiation across a wide range of energies. High-energy cosmic rays from outside the solar system, the remnants of ancient supernova explosions, are partially absorbed by the atmosphere. Their energy distributed across cascades of secondary particles that reach the surface at vastly reduced intensity. The third layer is the magnetic field again, but operating differently at lower altitudes, channeling trapped radiation into specific zones like the Van Allen belts, keeping the most energetic particles concentrated in regions far above where humans live and work. The combined effect is that a person on Earth's surface receives approximately 2.4 millisieverts per year from natural sources. That is the baseline human biology evolved under. The radiation environment in which every cell in your body learned to repair damage and maintain function. The moon has none of these protections. No magnetosphere, no atmosphere, no shielding of any kind between the surface and the full unfiltered radiation environment of interplanetary space. The first direct measurements of radiation dose on the lunar surface were made by China's Chang'e 4 lander in 2019 using the Lunar Lander Neutrons and Dosimetry instrument. The measurements confirmed what models had predicted. The charged particle dose rate on the lunar surface is approximately 13.2 microgray per hour. Converted to biologically relevant dose equivalents and annualized, the total radiation exposure on the lunar surface from galactic cosmic rays alone is approximately 380 to 416 millisieverts per year, depending on solar cycle conditions. Compare that number to the Earth baseline, 2.4 millisieverts per year on the ground, 380 to 416 on the moon. That is more than 150 times the natural background radiation that human bodies are adapted to handle. But that number represents only the chronic, continuous baseline. It does not include the acute threat. Solar particle events are eruptions of high-energy protons from the surface of the star we orbit. They are unpredictable. They can occur with little warning, and they can deliver radiation doses that are not merely elevated, but potentially lethal within hours. A major solar particle event can produce an exposure of more than 1,000 millisieverts in a single episode. At that level, acute radiation syndrome becomes a real possibility. Nausea, vomiting, immune suppression, organ damage, death if untreated. On Earth, solar particle events are invisible. The magnetosphere deflects the protons. The atmosphere absorbs what gets through. An astronaut on the surface of the moon during a major event has no such protection. They must reach shelter immediately. That shelter must have walls thick enough to attenuate the particle flux to survivable levels. Current estimates suggest that approximately 2 to 3 meters of lunar regolith would be needed to reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure to levels comparable to Earth's natural background. For solar particle events, the shielding requirement is somewhat lower because the particles are less energetic, but the need for immediate access to that shielding is absolute. A habitat module made of aluminum or composite materials, the kind currently envisioned for the early phases of the moon base, does not provide adequate radiation shielding on its own. Thin walls actually make the problem worse in some cases. When high-energy galactic cosmic rays strike metal walls, they generate secondary radiation. A shower of neutrons and gamma rays produced by the interaction of the incoming particle with the nuclei of the wall material. This secondary radiation can be more biologically damaging than the primary particles. The phenomenon is well documented. It means that simply putting a metal roof over an astronaut's head does not solve the radiation problem. It may make certain components of the radiation environment worse. The solution that NASA and international researchers have converged on is regolith shielding, piling lunar soil on top of habitats to create a thick barrier that absorbs incoming radiation without generating dangerous secondaries. Regolith is composed primarily of silicates and oxides, materials with lower atomic numbers than metals, which produce fewer secondary particles per interaction. A regolith layer of sufficient thickness could reduce interior dose rates to acceptable levels for long-duration stays. But building that shield is itself a massive engineering challenge. Moving and piling hundreds or thousands of tons of regolith on the lunar surface requires heavy equipment. That equipment must operate in vacuum, in extreme temperatures, in dust that destroys mechanical components, and in 1/6 gravity where traction is limited and material behaves differently than it does on Earth. Garcia Gallen himself acknowledged that just getting rovers to gain enough traction to move rocks and build berms on the lunar surface will be a significant challenge. The regolith compresses readily, which is helpful for building landing pads, but scooping and stacking it requires machines that have never been tested in the actual lunar environment. Until the shielding is in place, every crew member on the base is accumulating radiation dose at a rate that exceeds career limits within a few years. NASA's current career dose limits for astronauts are calculated to keep the risk of exposure-induced cancer death below a defined threshold. At lunar surface dose rates, those limits would be reached far more quickly than they are on the International Space Station, where the magnetosphere still provides partial protection. A 6-month lunar stay could consume a significant fraction of an astronaut's total allowable career dose. Multiple rotations to the moon could become biologically impossible for individual crew members, forcing NASA to maintain a much larger astronaut corps than current plans envision. And there is a subtlety that makes the radiation problem even harder to manage. Galactic cosmic ray intensity varies inversely with solar activity. During solar maximum, the heightened solar magnetic field partially deflects incoming galactic cosmic rays, reducing the chronic dose on the lunar surface. But solar maximum is also when solar particle events are most frequent and most intense. During solar minimum, the chronic galactic cosmic ray dose rises because the solar magnetic field is weaker. The base cannot win. In one phase of the solar cycle, the background is higher. In the other phase, the acute risk is higher. There is no quiet period. There is no season of safety. The radiation is always there, varying only in which type of threat is dominant. This is the second dimension of the environment that a moon base must survive. Not for a visit, not for a flag planting ceremony. For years, continuously, with biological consequences that accumulate silently inside every person who lives there. And then the star we orbit sets below the horizon. And the third threat begins. The moon rotates on its axis once every 29.5 Earth days. Because its rotational axis is tilted only 1.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane, most locations on the lunar surface experience approximately 14 Earth days of continuous sunlight, followed by approximately 14 Earth days of continuous darkness. There is no twilight. There is no gradual transition. The Terminator, the boundary between day and night, crawls across the surface at roughly 15 kilometers per hour, and behind it the temperature drops with a speed and severity that has no parallel on Earth. During the lunar day, surfaces exposed to direct sunlight reach temperatures of approximately 127 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to boil water at sea level on Earth, hot enough to degrade many polymers, adhesives, and elastomers used in spacecraft construction. Equipment operating on the sunlit surface must radiate excess heat into space to avoid overheating. A process complicated by the fact that the surrounding regolith is also radiating heat upward from below. When the Terminator passes and the 14-day night begins, those same surfaces plunge to approximately negative 173 degrees Celsius. In permanently shadowed craters near the South Pole, where the base is planned, temperatures drop even further to negative 238 degrees Celsius or below. These are among the coldest measured temperatures in the entire solar system, colder than the surface of Pluto. The swing between these two extremes, a range of roughly 300 degrees Celsius, repeats every 29.5 days. Every material in every structure on the surface expands during the day and contracts during the night. Metals, composites, glass, sealants, wiring insulation, all of them undergo thermal cycling that induces mechanical stress. Over repeated cycles, that stress produces fatigue. Microscopic cracks form, joints loosen, seals that were airtight on the first cycle become less so on the 100th. On Earth, thermal cycling is a well-understood failure mechanism. Bridges, aircraft, and buildings are designed to accommodate temperature swings of perhaps 50 to 80 degrees Celsius across a full year. Lunar structures must accommodate 300 degrees Celsius every month. The engineering margin for thermal fatigue is consumed far more rapidly, and the consequences of failure are far more severe, because every structural element is also a pressure boundary, separating breathable air from hard vacuum. The thermal challenge is compounded by the near total absence of atmosphere. On Earth, the atmosphere acts as a thermal buffer. It absorbs heat during the day and releases it at night, moderating temperature swings. Convection, the movement of warm air upward and cool air downward, distributes heat across surfaces and through structures. None of this exists on the moon. Heat transfer on the lunar surface occurs only through radiation and direct conduction. There is no air to carry warmth from a heated habitat to a cold regolith surface. There is no breeze to equalize temperature gradients. Every object on the moon is thermally isolated from every other object, except where they physically touch. This means that a habitat module sitting on the lunar surface during the 14-day night is radiating its internal heat directly into space at a temperature of approximately 3 degrees above absolute zero. The module is a warm island in an ocean of cold so profound that maintaining interior temperatures requires continuous active heating. If the heating system fails, interior temperatures begin dropping within hours. Water lines freeze, battery chemistry slows, electronics malfunction. Within a day, the habitat becomes uninhabitable. Within a few days, it becomes unrecoverable. Power is the lifeline, and power during the lunar night is the single most critical engineering challenge of the entire moon base concept. Solar panels, which generate electricity abundantly during the 14-day lunar day, produce nothing during the 14-day night. Zero. For 2 weeks, the base must survive on stored energy or alternative power sources. Battery technology at current energy densities cannot sustain a crude habitat through 14 days of darkness. The mass of batteries required would be enormous, requiring dozens of additional launches to deliver. This is why NASA's ignition plan includes a nuclear fission reactor. A 20-kilowatt reactor would provide continuous electricity regardless of solar conditions. But no nuclear reactor has ever been operated on the surface of another world. The engineering challenges of deploying, shielding, cooling, and maintaining a fission reactor in the lunar environment are substantial. The reactor must be positioned far enough from the habitat to protect the crew from its own radiation, but close enough to deliver power through cables that must survive the same thermal cycling and dust exposure as everything else on the surface. If the reactor is not ready when the first long-duration crews arrive, the alternative is radioisotope power systems, which generate electricity from the decay of radioactive isotopes. These systems are proven. They have powered deep space missions for decades, but their power output is measured in hundreds of watts, not kilowatts. Sustaining a habitat with life support, heating, lighting, communications, and scientific equipment requires orders of magnitude more power than a radioisotope generator can provide. The thermal environment of the moon is not a problem that can be solved once and forgotten. It is a recurring siege. Every 29.5 days, the base transitions from an environment where the primary threat is overheating to an environment where the primary threat is freezing. Every transition stresses every material, every seal, every joint, every connection in every system. The cumulative effect of those transitions over months and years is degradation. Degradation of structures, of seals, of power systems, of thermal control hardware, of everything that keeps the interior of the habitat in the narrow band of conditions that human biology requires. There is a fourth environmental threat that operates on the lunar surface continuously, invisibly, and with a violence that the other three do not share: micrometeoroids. Tiny fragments of rock and metal, some smaller than a grain of sand, traveling through the near-lunar environment at velocities that commonly exceed 90,000 kilometers per hour. On Earth, objects entering the atmosphere at those speeds burn up long before they reach the surface. The friction of atmospheric entry converts their kinetic energy into heat, light, and harmless vapor. That is what a shooting star is. A piece of space debris being destroyed by the atmosphere before it can reach the ground. The moon has no atmosphere, no friction, no burn-up. Every micrometeoroid that crosses the moon's path arrives at the surface with its full kinetic energy intact. A particle weighing less than a milligram at 90,000 kilometers per hour carries enough energy to excavate a crater many times its own diameter in solid metal and vaporize both the projectile and target material at the point of contact. This is not the same threat as dust. Dust abrades, clogs, and infiltrates. Micrometeoroid impact punctures. The difference is between slow degradation and a sudden, potentially catastrophic breach. A pressurized habitat module on the lunar surface presents a target to the micrometeoroid environment that did not exist during Apollo. The Apollo lunar modules were on the surface for at most 3 days. The statistical probability of a micrometeoroid strike large enough to penetrate the hull during that window was low. Acceptable. Within the margins of risk that mission planners could tolerate for a short duration stay. A habitat module designed to remain on the surface for years occupies a fundamentally different statistical position. The probability of impact is a function of surface area, exposure time, and the local flux of particles. As exposure time increases from days to months to years, the cumulative probability of at least one impact event energetic enough to damage the hull approaches levels that cannot be ignored. NASA and its international partners have extensive experience with micrometeoroid protection in low Earth orbit. The International Space Station uses multi-layer shielding called Whipple shields, named after the astronomer Fred Whipple, who proposed the concept. A Whipple shield works by placing a thin outer bumper at a distance from the pressure wall. When a micrometeoroid strikes the bumper, it breaks apart and its energy is dispersed across a wider area, reducing the penetration risk to the inner wall. The station has sustained multiple micrometeoroid impacts over its lifetime, including strikes that have cracked outer windows and damaged radiator panels. In 2021, the station's robotic arm was struck by a micrometeoroid that left a visible hole in its thermal blanket. On the moon, Whipple shielding could be applied to habitat modules, but the design constraints differ. When a micrometeoroid strikes the regolith near the habitat, the impact ejects secondary particles, fragments of lunar rock accelerated to velocities that can damage nearby surfaces. This secondary ejector does not exist in orbital environments. A habitat on the moon faces both the primary flux from space above and the secondary flux from impacts on the ground around it. Spacesuits are even more vulnerable than habitats. A suit is a flexible pressure vessel with walls measured in millimeters. It cannot carry the heavy multi-layer shielding that a habitat module can. An astronaut performing a surface excursion is protected from micrometeoroids by the thickness of the suit fabric and the outer thermal micrometeoroid garment layer. That protection is effective against the smallest particles, but offers limited defense against anything in the upper range of the micrometeoroid size distribution. The probability of a suit penetrating strike during any single excursion is very low. Across hundreds of excursions over years of base operations, the cumulative probability becomes a factor that mission planners must account for. A suit breach on the lunar surface is not like a suit breach on the station. There is no airlock a few meters away. The astronaut may be kilometers from the habitat. The time between breach and incapacitation depends on the size of the hole, the rate of pressure loss, and the ability of emergency suit systems to compensate. For small punctures, sealant systems may buy enough time to return to the habitat. For larger breaches, the margin shrinks to minutes. The micrometeoroid environment does not fluctuate with the solar cycle the way radiation does. It does not cycle with the day-night terminator the way temperature does. It does not concentrate near airlocks the way dust does. It is constant, random, and democratic. It strikes everywhere at all times with no warning. And over the operational lifetime of a permanent base, it represents a continuous, low probability, high consequence threat that adds one more layer of risk to an environment already saturated with them. Dust that destroys equipment and lungs, radiation that damages cells from every direction with no respite, temperature swings of 300 degrees that fatigue every material on a monthly cycle. Each of these is a known, measured, documented threat. Each has been studied in laboratories, modeled in simulations, and confirmed by instruments on the lunar surface. None of them is a surprise. None of them is speculative. What is less well understood is what happens when all three act on the same systems simultaneously over extended periods. Dust that infiltrates seals already weakened by thermal cycling. Radiation that degrades polymers already stressed by temperature extremes. Thermal expansion that opens gaps already widened by abrasive dust intrusion. The interactions between these three environmental forces are not simply additive, they are synergistic. Each one accelerates the damage caused by the others. No habitat module has ever been tested under the combined, simultaneous, long-duration assault of lunar dust, lunar radiation, and lunar thermal cycling. No seal material has been validated for thousands of pressurization cycles in an environment where all three forces are operating at once. No life support system has been proven to maintain atmospheric integrity for months, under conditions where the filters are clogging with abrasive charged particles. The structural joints are fatiguing from thermal stress, and the electronics are accumulating radiation damage in their control circuits. These are not future problems. These are present unknowns. They are the questions that NASA's phased approach is designed to answer. Build incrementally, test in place, learn what breaks and why. That approach is sound. It is also an acknowledgement that the answers are not yet known, and that the moon-based plan is, in a very real sense, a live experiment conducted on a world that has destroyed every piece of human equipment ever left on its surface. The Apollo laser retroreflectors, the simplest and most durable instruments ever placed on the moon, passive mirrors with no electronics and no moving parts, have lost significant reflective efficiency over the decades due to dust accumulation. The lunar ejector and meteorites experiment left by Apollo 17 began overheating within weeks because electrically charged dust coated its surface, changed its thermal properties, and turned it into a heat trap. These were instruments designed to last. They were not designed to survive the moon. Nothing we have ever built was designed to survive the moon. Not for years. Not while keeping people alive inside it. That is the reality that waits beneath the announcements, beneath the funding numbers, beneath the artist renderings of astronauts standing in golden sunlight on a pristine grey plane. The surface is not pristine. The sunlight carries radiation, and the golden glow will give way in 14 days to a darkness so cold that the machinery keeping you alive will begin fighting for its own survival. What comes next is the question that transforms all of these environmental hazards from serious challenges into a potentially insurmountable burden. Because dust and radiation and thermal extremes are problems that missions can endure. What makes them terrifying is not any one of them alone. It is what happens when you can never leave. When the mission does not end, when every morning the same forces resume their assault on the same systems, and the systems must hold and keep holding and never stop holding, because the moment they fail, There is nothing between the crew and the void, except whatever margin of redundancy the engineers built in, and that margin on the moon is thinner than anyone would like to admit. There is a difference between surviving a place and living in it. Surviving requires endurance. You hold your breath, you bear the cold, you ration what you brought, and you leave before the margins run out. Living requires systems that do not pause, do not take days off, do not tolerate a single unscheduled interruption without consequences that cascade outward through every connected function. A mission survives. A base must live. And the difference between those two words is where the moon base problem transforms from a set of difficult engineering challenges into something that may be the hardest sustained operational task humanity has ever attempted. Everything described so far, the dust, the radiation, the thermal extremes, represents the environment acting on the base. What comes now is about what happens inside. Because while the environment is trying to destroy the base from the outside, the base itself must perform a continuous, flawless act of internal self-maintenance that has no precedent in the history of human engineering. The closest comparison is a nuclear submarine. A sealed vessel carrying a crew through a hostile medium for months at a time with no resupply, no evacuation, and no tolerance for critical system failure. But even a submarine operates within an environment that provides two things the moon does not: water for cooling and an atmosphere outside the hull that, in an emergency, a crew member could theoretically breathe. On the moon, the medium outside the habitat is vacuum. Not thin air, not low-pressure atmosphere. Vacuum. The absolute absence of breathable gas. A hull breach of any size is not an inconvenience or a slow leak to be patched at leisure. It is an immediate, violent event in which the pressure differential between the interior and exterior begins driving air outward at speeds that depend on the size of the opening. A hole, the diameter of a pencil in a pressurized habitat wall, would produce a loss rate fast enough to drop internal pressure to dangerous levels within hours. A larger breach would be faster. A catastrophic structural failure would be instantaneous. This means every seal, every weld, every joint, every window, every hatch, every pass-through for wiring and plumbing in the entire habitat structure is a potential point of failure that must maintain integrity continuously, under thermal cycling, under dust abrasion, under micrometeorite risk, for the entire operational life of the base. On the International Space Station, small leaks have been a recurring problem. In 2020, a slow pressure loss in the Zvezda service module was traced to cracks in a transfer chamber. The investigation took months. The repair required multiple spacewalks. The station continued to operate because it has redundant pressurized volumes and because Earth is 400 kilometers away, not 384,000. On a lunar base, the same crack would unfold in a fundamentally different context. The nearest replacement hardware is on Earth. The fastest possible delivery time. From the moment someone identifies the problem to the moment a replacement part touches the lunar surface is measured in months. Not days, not weeks, months. That assumes the part is available, that a launch vehicle is ready, that the trajectory window is favorable, and that the landing is successful. If the part is not available, if it must be manufactured, the timeline extends further. This is the arithmetic of lunar logistics, and it governs every aspect of base operations with a weight that no amount of clever engineering can fully eliminate. A human being requires approximately 840 grams of oxygen per day to survive. That oxygen must be continuously replenished inside the habitat as carbon dioxide is exhaled. The carbon dioxide must be removed from the atmosphere before it reaches concentrations that impair cognitive function and eventually cause unconsciousness and death. On the International Space Station, this is accomplished by a combination of systems. The oxygen generation system electrolyzes water to produce breathable oxygen. The carbon dioxide removal assembly uses chemical sorbent beds to capture exhaled carbon dioxide. The SABA-TA reactor combines that carbon dioxide with hydrogen to recover water, closing part of the loop. These systems work. They have operated for over 2 decades in low Earth orbit. They have also required continuous maintenance, periodic replacement of consumable components, and occasional emergency intervention when they malfunctioned. The carbon dioxide removal assembly on the station has experienced multiple failures, requiring crew time to diagnose and repair. Backup systems have been activated while primary systems were serviced. Spare parts have been delivered on resupply missions that arrive every few weeks. On the Moon, the same architecture must operate with equal reliability, but in a fundamentally different maintenance context. Spare parts cannot arrive in weeks. Consumable components must either last far longer than their station equivalents, or be stockpiled in quantities large enough to bridge the months between resupply. Every kilogram of spare life support hardware stored on the base was launched from Earth and landed on the Moon at a cost that dwarfs its weight in manufactured gold. Water is the most critical consumable and the most difficult to manage in a closed system. A human body requires approximately 2.5 to 3 liters of water per day for drinking alone. Additional water is needed for food preparation, hygiene, and equipment cooling. On the station, water recovery systems reclaim moisture from humidity in the air, from crew perspiration, and from urine. The recovery rate has reached approximately 98% after recent upgrades. That sounds nearly perfect. It still means 2% is lost with every cycle. Over months, that 2% accumulates into a deficit that must be made up from stored reserves or resupply. On the Moon, the same recovery rates would apply, but the resupply pipeline is longer and more expensive. If lunar water ice proves extractable, it could supplement the closed-loop system. But extraction is not guaranteed. The ice deposits at the South Pole have been detected indirectly through neutron spectroscopy and radar measurements. Their exact concentration, depth, distribution, and chemical purity remain unknown. Extracting water from permanently shadowed craters, where temperatures sit below negative 200 degrees Celsius, transporting it to the base, purifying it, and integrating it into the life support loop is an industrial process that requires dedicated equipment, energy, and crew time. None of these extraction systems have been built or tested on the Moon. They exist as engineering concepts, promising ones, but concepts nonetheless. Food presents another dimension of the resupply challenge that is difficult to compress. Unlike water, food cannot be recycled. Unlike oxygen, it cannot be generated from simple chemical precursors using existing technology. Every calorie consumed by every crew member must either have been launched from Earth or grown on site. Current plans for the early phases of the Moon base rely entirely on pre-packaged food delivered by cargo landers. The caloric requirement for a crew of 4 over a 6-month rotation is approximately 2 million kilocalories. That translates into roughly 1,800 kilograms of packaged food, not counting packaging weight, storage containers, or additional preparation equipment. 2,400 kilograms is a significant fraction of a cargo lander's total payload capacity, and food is only one item on the manifest. It competes for mass and volume with spare parts, medical supplies, scientific instruments, construction materials, water reserves, clothing, tools, and every other item the base needs to function. Every kilogram allocated to food is a kilogram not available for something else. The logistics planning for a sustained lunar presence is not a shipping problem. It is an optimization problem under constraints so tight that a single miscalculation can create a deficit that cannot be corrected until the next delivery arrives months later. NASA has studied on-site food production for decades. Hydroponic and aeroponic systems that grow plants under artificial lighting have been tested on the station with limited success. Lettuce, radishes, and a few other crops have been grown in microgravity. Scaling those experiments to produce a meaningful fraction of a crew's dietary needs on the moon would require dedicated growing facilities, artificial lighting powered by the same limited energy supply that runs everything else, a continuous supply of nutrients, and crew time for planting, monitoring, harvesting, and processing. In the early phases of the base, on-site agriculture would be a research experiment, not a food source. The base would remain dependent on Earth for every meal. This dependency is the structural vulnerability that runs beneath every other system. Power, life support, thermal control, radiation shielding, dust mitigation, all of these can be engineered. Solutions exist in concept and in varying stages of development. What cannot be engineered away is the fundamental fact that every consumable the crew depends on originates from Earth. Air, food, water, raw materials, none of it exists on the lunar surface in a form that human biology can use without industrial processing, and every piece of processing equipment was itself launched from Earth. The base does not harvest its environment, it defends against it. And the defense requires a continuous supply line stretching nearly 400,000 kilometers across empty space to the only world in the solar system that produces the things human beings need to stay alive. That supply line is the circulatory system of the base. If it flows, the base lives. If it is interrupted, the base begins to die. And the supply line depends on a chain of capabilities that must all function simultaneously. Launch vehicles must be available and operational on Earth. Payload integration must be completed on schedule. Launch windows must be met. Transit trajectories must be calculated and executed. Landing systems must deliver cargo intact to the lunar surface, a task that has a non-trivial failure rate even with modern technology. India's Chandrayaan 2 lander crashed during descent in 2019. Israel's Bereshit lander crashed in 2019. The Japanese Slim lander touched down but came to rest inverted in 2024. Intuitive Machines. IM-1 lander snapped a landing leg and fell over in 2024. A Japanese commercial lander crashed during touchdown in 2025. Each of these missions was uncrewed. Each carried instruments, not people and not the food and spare parts that people depend on to survive. But they illustrate a point that is easy to overlook in discussions of moon-based logistics. Landing on the moon is hard. It has a failure rate that, across all attempts by all nations and all companies in the modern era, is significantly above zero. When a cargo lander crashes, the payload is lost. If that payload contains 6 months of food or a critical life support component, The loss is not a setback. It is a potential catastrophe for the crew already on the surface waiting for it. Redundancy is the standard engineering response to single-point failures. Build two of everything. Ship spare parts in advance. Stockpile reserves. These are sound strategies, and NASA's phased approach incorporates them. But redundancy costs mass. Every backup system, every spare component, every reserve supply cache is additional payload that must be launched, transited, and landed. The more redundancy you build in, the more launches you need, the more money you spend, and the more opportunities there are for one of those additional launches to fail. This is the mathematical trap at the heart of lunar logistics. The moon's hostility demands redundancy. Redundancy demands more launches. More launches increase the probability that at least one will fail. Failure of a critical delivery demands even more redundancy, which demands even more launches. The cost curve does not flatten. It steepens. And it steepens against a political and budgetary reality in which space funding is never guaranteed beyond the current administration's term. The International Space Station has been continuously crewed since November of 2000. That streak of 25 years has been sustained by the combined efforts of the United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada, supported by multiple independent launch systems capable of reaching the station on different timelines and trajectories. If one system failed, another could compensate. When the space shuttle was grounded after the Columbia disaster in 2003, Russian Soyuz vehicles carried the burden alone. When Russian launch capacity was constrained, SpaceX Crew Dragon filled the gap. A lunar base, at least in its early phases, would have far less redundancy in its transportation architecture. The number of vehicles capable of landing cargo on the moon is small. The number capable of landing crew is even smaller. A grounding of the primary crew landing system, whether for technical failure, investigation, or redesign, could leave astronauts on the moon without a ride home for an extended period. On the station, that scenario is survivable because resupply can continue by other means, and evacuation remains possible through alternative vehicles. On the moon, the alternatives are fewer and the consequences of delay are more severe. There is another dimension of permanence that receives surprisingly little attention in public discussions of the moon base. Maintenance, not emergency repairs, not the dramatic patching of a hull breach or the heroic replacement of a failed pump. Routine maintenance, the daily, weekly, monthly cycle of inspections, adjustments, cleaning, lubricating, calibrating, replacing, and testing that keeps complex systems running. On the International Space Station, the crew spends a significant portion of their working hours on maintenance tasks. Some estimates put it as high as 30 to 40% of total crew time. These tasks include replacing filters in the air revitalization system, servicing the water recovery system, performing diagnostic checks on electrical systems, repairing exercise equipment, maintaining the toilet, cleaning ventilation ducts, and dozens of other activities that individually seem minor but collectively are essential to keeping the station operational. On the moon, the maintenance burden would be equal or greater because every system is operating under harsher conditions than on the station. Dust infiltration adds cleaning and inspection tasks that do not exist in the station's relatively clean orbital environment. Thermal cycling adds structural inspection requirements. Radiation damage to electronics adds diagnostic and replacement cycles. And every maintenance task that requires an external component, a new filter, a replacement valve, a fresh sorbent cartridge, draws from a finite stockpile that cannot be replenished on demand. Crew time on a lunar base is not unlimited. A crew of 4 people working 8-hour days produces approximately 224 person-hours of productive work per week. Subtract time for meals, exercise, sleep, personal hygiene, communication with mission control, psychological decompression, and the overhead of living in a confined space, and the available working hours shrink further. If 30 to 40% of that time goes to maintenance, the remaining hours must be divided among scientific research, construction, surface operations, and the in-situ resource utilization activities that are supposed to make the base increasingly self-sufficient. The trade-off is stark. Every hour spent maintaining existing systems is an hour not spent advancing the capabilities that would reduce future maintenance needs. Every hour spent fixing what is already breaking is an hour not spent building what might prevent things from breaking in the future. The base is running on a treadmill, and the treadmill is accelerating because the systems are aging, the environment is degrading them, and the only way to slow the degradation is to invest crew time that is already oversubscribed. This is the cycle that transforms a moon base from an engineering project into an endurance test. The environment attacks the systems. The systems require maintenance. Maintenance requires crew time and spare parts. Crew time is finite. Spare parts are finite and expensive to replenish. The environment continues its attack regardless of whether the maintenance keeps pace. If it does not keep pace, if a repair is deferred because the crew is busy, if a spare part is unavailable because the last cargo lander did not carry it, the deferred problem does not wait politely. It compounds. A small leak becomes a large leak. A worn seal becomes a failed seal. A degraded filter becomes a contaminated atmosphere. Engineers call this cascading failure, and it is the nightmare scenario for any isolated, self-contained system. On the station, cascading failures are mitigated by the proximity of Earth. Parts can be rushed up on the next available vehicle. Ground teams can diagnose problems in near real time. In extreme cases, the crew can evacuate. On the moon, the mitigation options are narrower. The diagnostic delay due to communication latency is small, only about 1.3 seconds each way, which is manageable. But the physical response time, the time to get a needed part or a rescue vehicle to the lunar surface, is measured in weeks to months. A cascading failure sequence on the moon might look something like this. A thermal control pump begins underperforming due to dust contamination in its bearings. The crew identifies the issue during a routine inspection. The repair requires a replacement bearing assembly that is not in the current spare parts inventory because it was deprioritized on the last cargo manifest in favor of life support consumables. The crew implements a workaround, running the pump at reduced capacity and compensating with secondary cooling loops. The workaround increases power consumption. The increased power consumption during the lunar night draws more heavily on the reactor or battery reserves. The deeper discharge of battery reserves during one night cycle reduces the margin available for the next night cycle. If a second system develops a problem during that period of reduced margin, the crew faces a situation where 2 partially degraded systems are straining a power budget that was designed for nominal operations. None of the individual failures in that sequence is catastrophic. None of them, taken alone, would end the mission. But their interaction creates a condition more dangerous than any single failure. because the resources available to address each problem have been depleted by the effort of managing the others. This is what happens when permanence meets hostility. Every day the base operates is a day that consumes margin. Margin in the spare parts inventory, margin in the power budget, margin in the crew's physical endurance and psychological resilience, and the environment does not provide opportunities to rebuild that margin. It only continues to erode it. Every element of the base that exists outside the pressurized habitat, every landing pad, every berm, every regolith radiation shield, every power cable, every antenna, every instrument array must be built, installed, connected, and maintained by astronauts working outside in spacesuits. The plan calls for this exterior construction to happen across dozens, potentially hundreds, of extravehicular activities over the course of the base's operational life. Each one of those activities is an independent risk event. An extravehicular activity on the moon is not a spacewalk on the station. In orbit, astronauts work in microgravity, tethered to the structure, moving deliberately with rehearsed procedures. Emergencies can be answered by retreating through the nearest airlock within minutes. Every exterior task is practiced in underwater simulation facilities before it is attempted in orbit. On the moon, the operational context is fundamentally different. The astronaut is working in 1/6 gravity, which sounds easier than microgravity but introduces its own complications. Tools have weight, materials have weight, the astronaut has weight, but the reduced gravity means that traction is limited. Pushing against a surface or pulling on a bolt generates reaction forces that, on Earth, would be absorbed by the friction between boots and ground. On the moon, with 1/6 the gravitational force and a surface covered in loose, fine-grained regolith, traction is unreliable. Astronauts during Apollo reported difficulty maintaining stable footing. They adapted to a hopping gait that worked for walking but would be poorly suited to heavy construction tasks requiring precise force application. The suits themselves are a constraint. The current generation of lunar space suits, being developed for the Artemis program by commercial partners, are more flexible than Apollo-era suits, but still impose significant limitations on dexterity, visibility, reach, and endurance. Gloves that must maintain pressure while allowing finger movement are inherently bulky. Fine motor tasks, connecting small electrical connectors, tightening precise fasteners, handling delicate instruments becomes slow and fatiguing work that would take minutes on Earth and can take hours in a pressurized glove. Visibility is limited to what the helmet allows. Peripheral vision is reduced. Looking down at your own hands while they're working on a waist-level task requires bending the entire torso inside a rigid upper shell. Each suit carries a limited supply of oxygen, cooling water, battery power, and carbon dioxide scrubbing capacity. The operational duration of a single extravehicular activity is constrained by these consumables. Current estimates for lunar surface excursions range from approximately 6 to 8 hours of useful working time per outing. That time includes transit to the work site, setup, the actual task, cleanup, and transit back. The effective productive time at the worksite may be 4 to 5 hours. For a construction task that on Earth would take a crew of workers a single day, the lunar equivalent might require multiple excursions spread across a week, each one consuming suit, consumables that must be replenished from the habitat's limited supplies. And every excursion carries the full burden of dust exposure. Every time a suit goes out, it returns coated in electrostatically charged regolith. Every airlock cycle introduces a fresh quantum of abrasive particles into the habitat. Every suit inspection after an excursion reveals new scratches on visors, new particles embedded in joint seals, new wear on the fabric of the outer thermal garment. The suits themselves have finite operational lives, measured not in years but in excursion cycles. After a certain number of outings, the cumulative damage from dust, thermal cycling, micrometeoroid exposure, and mechanical wear renders a suit unreliable. Replacement suits must be launched from Earth, landed on the Moon, and integrated into the base's suit maintenance infrastructure. The construction phase of the Moon base is not a single campaign that ends when the base is declared operational. Construction, expansion, repair, and replacement of exterior systems would continue for as long as the base exists. That means extravehicular activities would continue indefinitely, each one consuming consumables, each one exposing crew to the full suite of surface hazards, each one degrading the suits that make future activities possible. The construction process does not end. It becomes part of the permanent operational burden that the base must sustain. There is one more element of the logistics picture that deserves attention because it is rarely discussed and it is potentially decisive. Earth does not always face the Moon on the same schedule. Orbital mechanics create windows and constraints that limit when launches can occur, when trajectories are efficient, and when landing sites are accessible. The lunar South Pole, with its extreme lighting conditions and challenging terrain, further constrains the landing windows. Not every day is a good day to land at the South Pole, not every week. The interaction of orbital mechanics, solar geometry, and terrain features creates a rhythm of access that does not align with the rhythm of human need. If a crew member is injured and needs evacuation, the evacuation cannot happen on an arbitrary Tuesday. A return vehicle must be fueled and ready. A launch window must be open. A trajectory must be calculated. The crew member must be transported to the return vehicle, which may not be co-located with the habitat. The time from medical emergency to launch could be days even under ideal conditions. Under adverse conditions, it could be longer. This is not a problem that technology solves in any simple way. Orbital mechanics is physics. It does not negotiate. It does not respond to urgency. It provides windows, and between those windows, it provides nothing. A base that depends on time-critical resupply or evacuation must either accept the constraints that physics imposes or maintain standby vehicles and launch readiness at extraordinary cost. Crew rotation itself is a logistics event of enormous complexity and risk that repeats on a fixed schedule for as long as the base is permanently occupied. Every 6 months, under the current plan, a fresh crew must arrive and the outgoing crew must depart. That sounds simple. It is not. Each crew rotation requires a crewed landing on the lunar surface, and lunar landing has a non-trivial failure rate, even for uncrewed deliveries. A crewed landing must perform flawlessly in navigation, propulsion, life support during descent, and the ability to abort if conditions are unsafe. An aborted landing means the incoming crew remains in orbit, or returns to Earth. The outgoing crew stays on the surface, their 6-month consumables budget forced to stretch across weeks or months of unplanned extension. Each rotation also requires a crew descent from the lunar surface. The outgoing crew must board their return vehicle, launch from the surface, achieve lunar orbit, and transit back to Earth. Every launch is a propulsive event that consumes fuel, generates exhaust, and sends shockwaves across the surrounding regolith. The landing pad and nearby infrastructure must be designed to withstand repeated launch and landing blasts without degradation that would compromise subsequent operations. Debris thrown by rocket exhaust is a significant concern. Without an atmosphere to slow them, particles of regolith accelerated by engine exhaust can travel enormous distances at high velocities, striking habitat modules, solar panels, and other surface assets far from the pad. This is one reason the ignition plan calls for berms around landing pads, but building those berms is itself a construction task that requires the extravehicular activities described above. The crew rotation schedule also creates a period of heightened vulnerability during each transition. When the outgoing crew departs and the incoming crew arrives, there is a handover period during which base systems must be transferred from one team to another. Knowledge must be passed. Ongoing maintenance issues must be briefed. Equipment quirks, workarounds, and accumulated experience must be communicated. If the rotation happens cleanly, with an overlap period where both crews are present, this handover can be thorough. If the rotation is disrupted, if the incoming crew is delayed, if the outgoing crew must depart before their replacements arrive, the base could face a gap during which no crew is present, or during which a partial crew must manage all base functions with reduced capacity. Every rotation is also a medical event. The outgoing crew has spent 6 months in 1/6 gravity. Their bodies have partially adapted to lunar conditions, losing bone density, redistributing fluids, decondition in cardiovascular capacity. They must endure the physical stress of ascent, transit, and re-entry into Earth gravity. The incoming crew arrives fully conditioned to Earth gravity, but must immediately begin operating in an environment where their coordination, spatial perception, and physical intuition must recalibrate. The first days on the surface are an adaptation period during which crew performance is reduced and the risk of accidents is elevated. Each rotation, in sum, is not a simple swap of personnel. It is an operational campaign involving a crewed lunar landing, a crew handover, a crewed lunar ascent, and transit in both directions, all of which must succeed in sequence for the base to continue operating on its planned schedule. A failure or delay at any point in that sequence propagates forward, extending stays, depleting consumables, and straining the systems that were sized for nominal rotation intervals. And this campaign repeats every 6 months, indefinitely, for as long as the base is called permanent. The cumulative picture of lunar base operations that emerges from all of these factors: life support, water, food, power, maintenance, spare parts, logistics, transport reliability, landing risk, crew time, and the unrelenting environmental assault is not a picture of impossibility. It is a picture of extreme, sustained, compounding difficulty. Each individual problem has been studied. Each individual problem has proposed solutions. What has not been fully tested is whether all of those solutions can function simultaneously, under real conditions, for extended periods, without the cumulative burden exceeding the capacity of the systems and people bearing it. NASA's phased approach is designed to confront exactly this question. Build capability incrementally. Test each system in the actual environment before depending on it. Learn what fails and why before committing crews to long-duration stays. That approach is rational and it is responsible, but there is a tension embedded in it that is worth naming explicitly. The phased approach assumes that each phase will reveal its problems early enough to be corrected before the next phase begins. It assumes that the discovery of a critical failure mode in Phase 1 will result in a redesign that is funded, developed, tested, and deployed before Phase 2 commits crews to longer stays. It assumes, in other words, that the political and budgetary support for the program will persist through setbacks, delays, cost overruns, and the inevitable moments when something goes wrong on the moon, and the question shifts from whether we can build a base to whether we should. Every previous moon-based proposal in NASA's history was cancelled before it reached the point where hardware was tested on the surface. Constellation was cancelled. Artemis Base Camp was never funded. The Space Exploration Initiative of 1989 was cancelled. The proposals of the 1970s never left the study phase. Each cancellation had its own specific causes, but they share a common thread. The sustained political commitment required to maintain a program through the long, expensive, unglamorous phase between the first announcement and the first permanent crew was not forthcoming. The ignition plan is betting that this time will be different, that the combination of commercial launch capability, executive direction, international partnership, and public enthusiasm generated by the Artemis II mission will sustain the program through the inevitable difficulties. That when a cargo lander crashes, when a habitat seal fails during testing, when the cost estimates rise, when the schedule slips, the commitment will hold. That bet may pay off. The conditions are genuinely more favorable than they have been at any point in the past. But physics is indifferent to political conditions. The lunar environment does not moderate itself because an administrator gave a confident speech. It is a barren vacuum that operates by mechanical forces alone. And the physics of sustaining human life on that world are not affected by how much money is allocated or how enthusiastic the administrator is at the press conference. The physics say that every day a moon base operates is a day that something is wearing out, running low, cycling toward failure, and waiting for a replacement that is months away and may not survive the landing. The physics say that the margin between operational and catastrophic is thinner on the moon than anywhere humans have ever lived. And the physics say that permanence, the very thing that defines a base as opposed to a mission, is the multiplier that takes every manageable risk and stretches it across a timeline where the probability of compound failure approaches certainty. What the physics cannot tell us, and what we must now confront, is what all of this means for the idea that the moon is humanity's next home. Because the deepest question raised by the ignition plan is not whether we can build 4 habitat modules and land a nuclear reactor. It is whether the moon, close enough to see with the naked eye, familiar enough to feel like an obvious destination, is a world that will ever truly let us stay. There is a kind of loneliness that no human being has ever experienced. Not the loneliness of an empty house or a quiet night. Not the loneliness of a ship at sea or a research station in Antarctica. Those are loneliness within a living world. A world where air moves, weather changes, water flows, and the systems that sustain your biology are woven into the fabric of the planet around you. Even in the most remote place on Earth, you are surrounded by an atmosphere that provides oxygen without asking. A magnetic field that deflects lethal radiation without your awareness. A biosphere that recycles your waste and regenerates your food supply on a planetary scale, and a gravitational and thermal environment that your body evolved over 4 billion years to tolerate. The moon offers none of this. The moon offers nothing. And the psychological reality of living for months on a world that offers nothing, in a habitat where every breath of air, every sip of water, every degree of warmth above freezing is manufactured and maintained by machines that can fail, is a dimension of the moon-based challenge that engineering alone cannot fully address. NASA studies the psychological effects of isolation extensively. Analog missions on Earth have placed small crews in enclosed habitats for up to 1 year to study group dynamics, stress, conflict resolution, sleep disruption, and cognitive performance. The International Space Station has provided decades of additional data on how human beings respond to living in confined, artificial environments far from home. The findings are consistent and sobering. Crews in isolated environments experience increased rates of interpersonal conflict, sleep disruption, cognitive fatigue, motivational decline, and emotional flattening over time. The severity of these effects correlates with the degree of isolation, the duration of the mission, the size of the crew, the variety of available activities, and the perceived difficulty of evacuation. On the station, the knowledge that a return to Earth is possible within hours provides a psychological safety net that measurably reduces stress. Astronauts have described looking out the window at Earth and drawing comfort from its proximity, its visibility, and the knowledge that friends, family, and the entire infrastructure of human civilization are right there, just below. On the moon, the Earth would hang in the sky, a blue and white marble close enough to see continents and city lights on the night side, and it would be utterly unreachable in any time frame that matters during an emergency. 3 days of transit in one direction, 3 days back, and that assumes a return vehicle is ready, fueled, and accessible. The psychological literature on isolation identifies a specific phenomenon called the third quarter effect. In missions of defined duration, crew morale and performance tend to dip most severely at approximately the 3-quarter mark, when the novelty of the experience has worn off, and the end is still far enough away to feel unreachable. For a 6-month lunar rotation, that dip would occur around the 4-month mark. 4 months into a stay in a pressurized habitat the size of a small apartment, surrounded by vacuum, breathing recycled air, eating packaged food, performing repetitive maintenance tasks, and knowing that the nearest hospital, the nearest forest, the nearest open sky is 3 days of spaceflight away. The communication delay between the Moon and Earth is approximately 1.3 seconds in each direction. That's short enough for near real-time conversation, unlike Mars, where delays of up to 22 minutes make dialogue impossible. But that near real-time connection comes with this psychological cost of its own. The crew can see Earth. They can talk to Earth. They can watch live news, receive messages from family, hear their children's voices, and they cannot touch any of it. The proximity is close enough to feel almost normal, almost connected, which makes the impossibility of physical return during the mission feel sharper rather than softer. A crew on Mars would be psychologically prepared for total isolation. A crew on the Moon lives in a strange middle ground, close enough to be reminded constantly of what they are missing, too far away to access any of it. Sleep is another factor that the lunar environment complicates in ways that analog studies on Earth cannot fully replicate. The 14-day light and dark cycle disrupts circadian rhythms that evolved under a 24-hour cycle. During the 2-week lunar day, sunlight streams through any window continuously, requiring complete light blocking measures to create artificial darkness for sleep. During the 2-week lunar night, the absence of any natural light for 14 consecutive days can trigger seasonal affective responses, depression, and disruption of melatonin regulation. Artificial lighting schedules can partially mitigate these effects, but the deep biological expectation of a daily light and dark cycle is not easily overridden by LED panels on a timer. And beneath all of these psychological pressures lies a truth that no amount of crew selection, psychological training, or support protocol can fully eliminate. The crew knows at every moment of every day that they are alive only because the machines around them are working. The air they breathe is manufactured. The temperature they feel is regulated. The water they drink has been extracted from their own bodies and recycled. The walls around them are the only barrier between their living tissue and a vacuum that would kill them in seconds. That knowledge, held continuously for months, produces a specific kind of stress that psychologists call existential awareness of environmental dependence. It is the understanding that you are not living in a place. You are living inside a machine, and if the machine stops, you stop. On Earth, this awareness does not exist. The environment is hostile in places. Cold in winter, hot in summer, wet in monsoon season, but it is never instantly lethal. A power failure in a house during a cold night is uncomfortable. A power failure in a lunar habitat during the 14-day night is a countdown. Not metaphorical countdown, a literal one. Interior temperatures begin dropping, battery reserves begin depleting. The crew has hours, perhaps a day, to restore power or implement emergency procedures before the habitat becomes too cold for human survival. The psychological burden of that countdown existing as a permanent background reality, not as an active emergency but as an ever-present possibility, shapes the experience of living on the moon in ways that are difficult to simulate and impossible to eliminate. It can be managed. Crews can be trained. Support systems can be designed, but it cannot be removed because it is not a perception error. It is an accurate assessment of the situation. The machines are keeping you alive. If the machines fail, you die. That is not anxiety. That is reality. Now, step back from the individual crew experience and consider the base as a system, operating not for one rotation but for years. Decade-scale permanence, the kind of sustained presence that the ignition plan envisions as its ultimate objective. Every system in the base has a design life. Habitat modules, life support components, power systems, thermal control hardware, seals, wiring, insulation, all of it is rated for a specific number of operational hours or cycles before it must be inspected, refurbished, or replaced. On Earth, infrastructure maintenance is so woven into civilization that it is invisible. Roads are repaved, bridges inspected, water mains replaced. The entire built environment is in constant renewal, supported by an industrial economy that manufactures components on demand and deploys a workforce trained to install them. On the moon, every component of that renewal chain must be imported from Earth, or, eventually, manufactured on site using resources and equipment that were themselves imported from Earth. The base does not exist within an industrial economy. It exists at the end of the longest, most expensive, most fragile supply line in human history, And as the base ages, as its systems accumulate thermal cycles and radiation damage and dust contamination, the rate at which components need replacement accelerates, while the cost and difficulty of delivering those replacements remains constant or increases. This is the maintenance curve that every long-duration facility in a hostile environment eventually confronts. Early in its life, the facility is new. Systems perform at or above their design specifications. Maintenance requirements are low, spare parts inventories are full, the crew's time is available for productive work. As years pass, systems age, failure rates increase, maintenance consumes more crew time, spare parts inventories deplete. The balance between productive work and survival work shifts, and at some point, the facility crosses a threshold where the effort required to keep it running exceeds the capacity of the crew to provide it without external support. On Earth, that threshold triggers renovation or replacement. Old buildings are torn down and rebuilt. Aging ships are retired. Infrastructure is upgraded. On the Moon, renovation means additional launches, additional landings, additional cost, and additional risk of delivery failure. Retirement is not an option if the goal is permanent presence. The base cannot be abandoned and rebuilt. It must be maintained in place, continuously, against an environment that never relents. There is a concept in reliability engineering called mean time between failures. It describes, statistically, how long a system operates on average before experiencing a failure. For any complex system with many components, the overall mean time between failures is shorter than the mean time between failures of any individual component, because the system fails when any of its components fails. A habitat with 1,000 components, each rated for 10,000 hours of operation, will experience a component failure on average every 10 hours. Not the same component, a different one each time, but always something. In a well-supplied, well-staffed facility with easy access to replacement parts, that failure rate is manageable. Failures are diagnosed, parts are replaced, operations continue. On the Moon, each failure draws from a finite spare parts inventory. Each repair consumes irreplaceable crew time. Each diagnosis requires expertise that may or may not be present in the current crew rotation. And the failure rate does not decrease over time. It increases because aging systems fail more often than new ones. This is the mathematical reality that the word permanence conceals. Permanence sounds like stability. It sounds like a thing achieved and then maintained at a steady state. On the Moon, permanence is not a steady state. It is a constant expenditure of effort, resources, and ingenuity against an environment that degrades everything at a rate that does not diminish. The base does not reach a point where it is finished and simply works. It reaches a point where it exists and must be continuously defended. And here is where the Moon's proximity, the very quality that makes it seem like the obvious first destination for permanent human presence beyond Earth, becomes a paradox that cuts in the opposite direction. The Moon is close, 239,000 miles, 3 days of transit, 1.3 seconds of communication delay. Close enough that astronauts can see their homes with the naked eye. Close enough that resupply missions, while expensive, are within the current capability of the space industry. Close enough that the idea of a base feels natural, inevitable, the next logical step after orbital stations and short-duration surface missions. That closeness creates an expectation. The expectation that proximity equals accessibility, that accessibility equals feasibility, That feasibility equals sustainability. Each of those links in the chain feels self-evident. None of them is automatically true. Proximity means the moon is reachable. It does not mean the moon is habitable. Accessibility means hardware can be delivered. It does not mean hardware will survive. Feasibility means a base can be built. It does not mean a base can be maintained indefinitely against the compounding burden of environmental assault, logistics dependence, system aging, and crew endurance. Mars, by contrast, is so far away and so obviously hostile that no one harbors illusions about the ease of living there. The challenge is understood to be generational. The sheer difficulty is respected because it is undeniable. The moon does not receive that respect. It is treated, in public discourse and sometimes in policy, as a solved problem waiting for funding. We went there 50 years ago, we walked on it, we came home. How hard can it be to go back and stay? The answer, as everything in this story has tried to demonstrate, is that staying is a fundamentally different problem from going. And the moon's proximity disguises that difference because it makes the destination feel familiar, close, almost domestic, when it is in fact one of the most hostile environments a human being could attempt to inhabit for an extended period. The lunar South Pole, specifically, presents challenges that compound the general hostility of the lunar surface. The lighting conditions are extreme. Sunlight arrives at angles so low that even small topographic features cast permanent shadows. The terrain is rough, cratered, and poorly mapped at the resolution needed for safe rover travel and habitat construction. The temperature gradients between sunlit ridges and permanently shadowed craters a few hundred meters away can span hundreds of degrees Celsius over very short distances. Navigation is complicated by the absence of a global magnetic field that would allow compass-based orientation. Dust behavior near the terminator, the boundary between light and shadow, is poorly understood. There is evidence that electrostatic forces levitate dust particles near the terminator, creating a ground-level haze that could obscure visibility and contaminate equipment in ways that midday or midnight surface operations would not encounter. The permanently shadowed craters themselves, the repositories of the water ice that makes the South Pole attractive, are among the most forbidding locations in the inner solar system. Temperatures reach negative 238 degrees Celsius. At those levels, not only water but carbon dioxide and ammonia are frozen solid. Equipment must withstand temperatures that render most metals brittle, most lubricants solid, and most electronics non-functional without specialized heating and insulation. The craters are in permanent darkness. Solar power does not function there. Any operation within them must carry its own power, its own light, and its own thermal protection, and must extract whatever resources it finds and transport them back to the base through terrain that is rough, poorly illuminated, and covered in the same abrasive, electrostatically charged dust that threatens every other surface operation. The water ice, if it is there in usable form, is not a faucet waiting to be turned on. It is a diffuse, frozen resource embedded in regolith at unknown concentrations, at unknown depths, in one of the coldest and most inaccessible environments anywhere in the solar system. Extracting it would require mining, heating, purifying, and transporting operations that constitute an entire industrial process chain, each link of which must function in conditions that no industrial process on Earth has ever been designed to tolerate. And yet the narrative persists. The narrative that the moon is close, that we have been there before, that a base is the natural next step, that the technology is nearly ready, that the funding is in place, that permanence is within reach. That narrative is not false. Every element of it is grounded in real capability and real progress, but it is incomplete. It omits the weight. It omits the relentlessness. It omits the fact that every system described in this story, life support, power, thermal control, dust mitigation, radiation shielding, logistics, maintenance, food, water, medical care, psychological support, must all function simultaneously, continuously, for years, on a world that corrodes and degrades every one of them at a rate that does not slow down. The International Space Station, humanity's most successful experiment in permanent human presence off the surface of the Earth, has required an estimated $150 billion in cumulative investment over its lifetime. It orbits 400 kilometers above a planet that provides the gravitational, atmospheric, and magnetic environment needed to simplify almost every aspect of its operation. It receives cargo every few weeks. It can evacuate its crew in hours. It operates in a thermal environment that, while challenging, is less extreme than the lunar surface. It is not subject to dust contamination. It is partially shielded from radiation by the magnetosphere, and it has still required continuous, expensive, multinational effort to maintain for 25 years. The moon base would operate at a greater distance, in a harsher environment, with longer resupply timelines, less redundancy in transportation, and a surface that actively attacks every component placed on it. The cost of sustaining it would not be lower than the station. It would almost certainly be higher, and the cost would not be a one-time investment. It would recur annually for as long as anyone calls the base permanent. This is not an argument that the moon base should not be attempted. The scientific value of sustained lunar presence is real. The technological lessons learned would inform every future effort at human expansion beyond Earth. The resources potentially available at the lunar South Pole, if they can be accessed, could reduce the cost of deep space missions by providing propellant and consumables closer to the destinations. The strategic and inspirational value of a human outpost on another world is immeasurable. These are legitimate reasons to pursue the goal. But the goal must be pursued with honest acknowledgement of what it demands. And what it demands is not a bold announcement followed by a decade of engineering. What it demands is a commitment to sustaining complex systems in a hostile environment for an indefinite period at enormous cost, with no guarantee that the systems will hold, that the funding will persist, that the supply chain will remain unbroken, or that the cumulative burden of permanence will not exceed the capacity of the technology and the institutions behind it. The terrifying reason we may never build a moon base is not that it is too far away. It is close. Not that the technology is absent. Much of it exists. Not that the funding is impossible. $30 billion over a decade is within the federal budget's capacity. Not that no one wants to go. Engineers, scientists, astronauts, and dreamers worldwide want this with a passion that is genuine and deep. The terrifying reason is that the moon is easy to reach and almost impossible to stay on. That the gap between landing and living is not a step, but a chasm. That every day of permanent habitation requires an act of sustained technological defiance against an environment that grinds, irradiates, freezes, bakes, and suffocates with perfect indifference. That the systems keeping the crew alive must never all fail at the same time, and the longer they run, the more likely some combination of them will. that the supply line must never break, and it stretches across 250,000 miles of vacuum. That the political will to fund this effort must never waver, and it must persist across administrations, across congresses, across decades of competing priorities, across the inevitable moments when something goes wrong and the cost of continuing rises sharply. The moon has been waiting for 4.5 billion years. It has no atmosphere to erode, no water to corrode, no life to transform. It is dead, patient, and permanent in its hostility. Every piece of hardware we send there will eventually be reduced to fragments by the same bombardment that has pulverized its surface for aeons. Every habitat will age, every seal will weaken, every filter will clog, every system will drift toward failure. And the question that defines the entire enterprise is not whether we can build a base on the moon. It is whether we can keep building it, keep repairing it, keep supplying it, keep defending it, day after day, year after year, against a world that never stops trying to reclaim the silence it has maintained since before life existed on Earth. The most unsettling truth is not that the moon is dangerous. Danger can be measured, mitigated, managed. The most unsettling truth is that the closer NASA moves toward a real lunar base, the more clearly the moon exposes the distance between reaching another world and making it a home. We can cross the void. We can plant boots in the regolith. We can build walls and pressurize them and fill them with air and call it a base. But the moon will never stop reminding us that we do not belong there. That every breath inside those walls is borrowed from a supply chain that stretches back to the only world that has ever kept us alive without asking anything in return. And that permanence, the word that turns a mission into a home, is not a destination you arrive at. It is a weight you carry, every single day, on a world that was never designed to help you bear it. The rockets are fueling, the contracts are signed, the astronauts are training, the hardware is being built, and the moon is waiting, exactly as it has always waited, silent, airless, and unforgiving, daring us to stay. Whether we can answer that dare is not a question of ambition or courage. It is a question of endurance on a scale that humanity has never been tested against. And the answer will not come from a press conference or a budget allocation. It will come from the first crew that tries to survive a full year inside a metal box on a dead world 250,000 miles from everything that has ever sustained human life, and discovers whether the systems hold, whether the supply line holds, whether they hold, or whether the moon, as it has done to every instrument and every experiment and every flag we have ever planted on its surface, quietly begins to win.